This is me, deep in the heart of Westminster, the part of London which is the seat of political power in the United Kingdom. And this is Conservative campaign headquarters, the nerve center of what is often called the most successful political party in the world, the Conservative Party. Across the ocean, in downtown Ottawa, is the headquarters of another Conservative party, the Conservative Party of Canada. These two Conservative parties have a lot in common besides their names. They are both major parties in very similar parliamentary systems. Both really like the color blue, and both even have the same party nickname, the Tories. But there is also a glaring difference. The UK's Conservative Party has dominated British politics for the last 50 years, and, almost in spite of itself, has won power in the last 4 elections. This is just my opinion as a long-time UK resident here, but it feels very much like a Conservative government is this country's default setting, and that a Labour government, or a government led by another party, is an aberration. I'm not Canadian, I'm American, but I've followed Canadian politics from a distance for a long time. And my impression of Canada's Conservative Party is that it is very much not the default governing party in Canada. This honor really belongs, for better or worse, to Canada's Liberal Party, currently led by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Trudeau has won the last 2 federal elections in Canada, and it looks increasingly likely, day by day, that he will be leading the Liberals into a 3rd election, an early election, later this summer or autumn. Before I could get this video finished, Justin Trudeau actually did call for a snap election, which will be held on the 20th of September 2021. But don't worry, that only makes the rest of this video more relevant, not less. Okay, back to our regularly scheduled video. Despite the quite serious scandals that Trudeau and his Liberal Party have been embroiled in during their 6 years in power, most pundits think that the Liberals will win, and so do I. Canada's Conservatives just don't seem like a government in waiting, and this fascinates me. These two conservative parties, which are so similar in so many ways and operate in such similar political systems, end up with just such different results. Is it just that the British people are naturally more right-wing than the Canadian people? I don't think so. I believe there are 3 very important differences. 3 differences which are not immediately apparent, which keep one group of Tories mostly in power and keeps another group of Tories mostly in opposition. That's what this video is about. Stay tuned and all will be explained. Hi everyone, Fredo Rockwell here. Before we start, I should explain I don't actually support either of these parties, so I'm not advocating any sort of plan of action here. As most longtime viewers will know, I'm a member of the Liberal Democrats, Britain's 3rd largest party. Not being from or living in Canada, I don't support any particular party there. The Liberal Party of Canada and the Liberal Democrats are both part of this organization called Liberal International, which I've never heard anyone actually refer to, but I don't feel any sort of loyalty to them. If I was Canadian, I really can't see myself as joining the Liberal Party. They're just way too smug and sleazy for my liking. But back to the main issue at hand, the Tories. Here are 3 advantages I think the British Conservatives have and that the Canadian Conservatives lack. Every experienced politician knows that you can maintain ideological purity or you can win elections, but rarely both. Few parties have embraced this political realism, from party leaders down to grassroots activists, with more gusto than the British Conservatives. Changing party policies to achieve power, even extremely central party policies, is almost a sort of Tory trademark. Most famously, for example, in 2016, Boris Johnson simultaneously wrote 2 newspaper columns for the Daily Telegraph about Brexit, one in favor and one against, before deciding to bin the pro-Remain version and publish the pro-Brexit version. Critics say he decided to go with the pro-Brexit column because he judged it most likely to advance his career, a decision which has proven correct. But this ideological chameleonism stretches much farther back then the parties shift from being pro-European to being pro-Brexit. The Conservative Party was once also the party of protectionism, but now positions itself as the party of free trade. It once championed extensive state intervention in the economy, but later became the party of free markets. Until recently, it was the party of conservative social values, but it now boasts a serial adulterer as its leader. And after decades of rolling back regulations and cutting taxes and spending, in the past 2 years, the Conservatives have embraced the opposite and are now the party of debt-fueled spending bonanzas and taxes designed to prevent people from eating junk food. This lack of ideological consistency has not caused problems as you might expect. It's rather been an enormous strength. As the 19th century English novelist Anthony Trollope once observed, "No reform, no innovation, no revolution stinks so foully in the nostrils of an English Tory as to be absolutely irreconcilable to him. When taken in the refreshing waters of office, any such pill can be swallowed." In other words, the Tories will embrace nearly any political policy which will bring them to power. And it's not just ideology which British Conservatives will drop in a heartbeat to gain or retain government. The most common word used by the media to describe the party during Conservative leadership contests is ruthless. Any leader who for a brief moment appears too weak to help the party win the next election will quickly find themselves a former leader pretty sharpish. My impression of Canada's Conservative Party is very different. For example, its current leader, Erin O'Toole, is working hard to reposition the party's stance on the environment. Most pundits would argue that he has to do this to have a shot at winning the next election, and he's struggling. At the Conservative Party Policy Convention in March, delegates considered a proposal which said, "Climate change is real," something a vast majority of Canadians believe, and then voted it down by a margin of 54% to 46%. During the debate, O'Toole used some tough language to try and persuade his party, saying the party cannot ignore the reality of climate change and that the debate is over. He also said, "We must also recognize that Canadians expect us to have a real plan for the environment. We need to boldly reclaim the environment as an area where Conservatives are leaders." But the Canadian Tories rejected their leader's pleas. Pleas based on a hard reality. In order to win the next election, the Conservatives will need to win more seats in Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritime provinces, parts of the country where rejecting global warming as a real thing goes down pretty badly. And that brings us to reason number 2. One reason the British Conservative Party doesn't need to worry much about ideological consistency is this is something that British Conservative voters have rarely expressed much interest in. The Conservative Party, more than any other political party I've encountered, is the party of the establishment, of maintaining the status quo. It doesn't particularly matter what that status quo happens to be, but whatever it is, the Conservatives will support it. And the British establishment, in turn, supports the Conservatives. This is a bit of a stereotype, but the typical Tory voter tends to be older, relatively prosperous, owns his or her own home, and is mostly based in England, and in particular in southern England. The good news for the Tories is that relatively prosperous homeowners living in the south of England make up a pretty big chunk of the population. There aren't enough of them to automatically deliver an outright victory to the Conservatives every election, but it gets them within shouting distance. If the Tories can build a coalition with one other decent-sized demographic, as they did in 2019 by reaching out to patriotic, pro-Brexit working-class voters in the north of England, they often romp home to victory. The Conservatives are helped by the British electoral system, known as first past the post. Boris Johnson may have won 365 seats in the 2019 election, giving him a working majority of 80 seats, but the Conservative Party did this despite only winning 42% of the popular vote. Like the UK, Canada also has a first-past-the-post voting system. What this means is that whoever wins the most votes in an electoral district, 40%, 30%, 20%, even less, is the winner, as long as they get more votes than any other candidate. But unlike their British counterparts, this system hurts the Canadian Conservatives. For example, In the 2019 Canadian federal election, the Conservatives came in first in the overall popular vote with 34%, narrowly beating out Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party, which garnered only 33% of the vote. But out of a total of 338 seats, the Canadian Tories only won 121, while the Liberals were awarded 157. Conservative voters are heavily concentrated in Canada's western provinces, and especially in Alberta, the heartland of Canada's energy sector, and kind of thin on the ground everywhere else. The Liberals, meanwhile, have strongholds in many major Canadian cities, dominate Canada's maritime provinces, and win a significant number of rural seats in Ontario and Quebec. In fact, the Conservatives have managed to win a majority of seats in Canada's House of Commons only once in the last 30 years, in 2011. And this was only because the Liberal Party was at a very low ebb at that time and came in third. The Conservatives' heavy concentration of voters in Canada's western provinces is for historic reasons, but it goes a long way to explaining why Conservative delegates rejected the statement on climate change earlier this year. Alberta's economy depends heavily on fossil fuel production, but what Western voters want, especially what Albertan voters want, is increasingly out of step with the rest of Canada. And then there is the issue of Quebec, Canada's second largest province, which has its own unique language and its own culture based on its French heritage. Although the Conservatives gained 26 seats overall from the previous election, they actually lost 2 seats in Quebec in 2019. This is despite the Liberal Party and Canada's third biggest party, the New Democrats, also losing seats in Quebec. All of these lost seats went to the Bloc Québécois, which is a party which promotes Quebec separatism at the federal level. And see, this is a great example of the sort of problems that Canada's Conservatives have. When the Liberals lose seats, the Conservatives need to pick them up in order to have a chance to win an election, and very often they don't. But back to Quebec. Conservative parties can do well in Quebec. In fact, a sort of conservative party known as the Coalition Avenir Québec, or CAQ, is currently in power at the provincial level. But no national-level Conservative Party has managed to capture a majority of Quebecois seats in a federal election since 1988. These consistently poor results in Quebec are perhaps the biggest reason the Tories have only managed to win that one majority in 30 years. The British Conservatives have a similar problem in Scotland, but when it comes to electoral arithmetic, Scotland is no Quebec. Scotland accounts for 42 constituencies and a parliament of 650 seats, just over 6% of the total. Quebec, in stark contrast, has 78 ridings, as they are known, out of the 338 in the Canadian House of Commons, making up a crucial 23% of all seats. The Tories in the UK simply do not need a strong performance in Scotland to form a majority. Case in point is the 2015 election, when the Conservatives won only 1 seat in Scotland, but still managed to get an overall majority in Parliament. Meanwhile, without winning, say, a third of the seats in Quebec, Canada's Conservatives will perennially struggle. So that brings us to the third, and I would argue most substantial difference between the two Conservative parties: their main opponents. The British and Canadian party systems are remarkably similar in many ways. Besides the two Conservative parties, each parliament has a socialist party of the left, historically rooted in the trade union movement, a centrist to center-left Liberal Party, a relatively large regional party seeking independence, and a small Green Party. The biggest difference between the two, I would argue, is the relative strength of the top 3 parties. In Canada, the Conservatives' main opponents are the relatively moderate Liberals, while in the UK, Tories square off an avowedly socialist Labour Party. Most British elections are framed as a choice between the Tories and the Labour Party. And although what I'm about to say is going to infuriate a lot of Labour supporters, this gives the Tories a huge advantage. Nothing motivates the comfortable, middle-class, status quo-loving residents of southern England to vote Conservative so much as a Labour leader who appears to actually believe what the Labour Party is meant to believe in. This was very much on display at the most recent general election in 2019, when Boris Johnson, a man who had been a laughingstock in British politics for decades, triumphed over the far-left Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. Corbyn was one of the most popular Labour leaders amongst Labour members for many decades, but he scared the bejesus out of much of the rest of the country. Only one Labour leader has successfully won a British general election in 47 years, Tony Blair. But Blair won as a centrist who rejected his party's socialist heritage. In Canada, things are very different. In Canada, at the national level, if the Conservatives don't win, then the Liberals do. And while the Liberals might be smug, self-righteous, opportunistic, and increasingly corrupt, they aren't advocating a far-left agenda. For a middle-of-the-road voter who mostly wants stability and continuity, there's nothing terribly frightening about the Liberals. And that is a huge problem for the Canadian Conservatives. Just as in the UK, nothing propels Canadian Conservatives into power as effectively as the fear of a far-left electoral victory. Don't believe me? Have a look at this. Each of Canada's 10 provinces has its own parliamentary system, with its own unique party structure. Although their names vary from province to province, Conservative parties are currently in government in 7 provinces: Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. In 4 of these provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario, the official opposition party, the second biggest party, is the Socialist New Democratic Party. In Prince Edward Island, the official opposition party is the Green Party, another party of the left. Only in New Brunswick and Quebec do Liberal parties form the official opposition, and politics in Quebec works very differently from the rest of Canada, so I'm not sure that's a very relevant example. Basically, as with the UK's Conservative Party, Canadian Conservatives do best when their opposition is a socialist party of the left. This has only happened at the federal level once in the last 30 years. Can you guess which year? Yes, it was that 2011 election, when the Liberals placed third. Second place was the Socialist New Democratic Party. Then, and only then, did the Conservatives win a majority. But this was a very rare occurrence. The Liberal Party are almost always one of the main 2 parties at any election, and that means the Canadian Conservatives are pretty much always kept in check. So viewers in the UK might be watching this and wondering, hey Fredo, are you saying that if the Labour Party hadn't displaced the British Liberal Party as one of the 2 main parties in our system about 100 years ago after World War I, then the British Tories would be as weak today as the Canadian Tories? In other words, are you putting the blame for successive Tory governments squarely at the feet of the Labour Party? Yes. Yes, I'm saying that. Of course I'm saying that. That's pretty obvious if you've been watching this far in the video, I think. But at the same time, one must admit that the few Labour governments which Britain has had have had an enormous impact on British life. Britain's National Health Service, for example, is a Labour innovation. It is now deeply rooted in the status quo here in the UK, and as part of the status quo, it is an institution that the Conservatives now endorse. Not always convincingly, perhaps, but there are no serious Tory voices calling for its abolition. Would the NHS have happened without Labour being the second party in the UK, even one with limited electoral success? Hard to say, but I would say most likely not, at least not the NHS that we know today. Also, I somehow doubt that I would be a member of the Liberal Democrats today if they had been the main governing party in the UK, the way the Liberal Party has been in Canada for the past century. Being the main party of government tends to attract politicians who are much more interested in power, in climbing to the top of that greasy pole, than anything else. No one joins the Liberal Democrats because they want to maximize the chance that they'll achieve political power, at least not if they're at all paying attention. But the same cannot be said for Canada's Liberal Party or Britain's Conservative Party. If your own personal political ambitions are more important than anything else, then joining one of these 2 parties makes total sense. And personally, I think the fingerprints of this sort of politician are pretty evident on virtually everything these parties do, and I don't want any part of that. So that's my take on what makes the British Tories and Canadian Tories different. Despite having a lot in common, both are products of their unique political environments. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. Also, let me know in the comments what you think of my ideas. You agree with me? Think I'm crazy? Let me know. I'd love to hear. And I'll see you guys in the next video.